I always thought I knew my son. He was everything to me. Brian, my only child, had always been a source of pride and joy. I'd spent years raising him, sacrificing my own needs to give him the best life I could provide. I was the type of mother who believed in tough love, but also in unconditional support. We had our ups and downs, like any family does, but I always thought our bond was unbreakable. Little did I know, that night would shatter everything I believed. It started like any other evening. The smell of fresh dinner wafted through the house. I'd spent the afternoon in the kitchen, preparing Brian's favorite meal, grilled chicken, mashed potatoes, and my special homemade gravy. I made it with love, knowing how he always enjoyed coming home to a hot, home-cooked meal. The table was set, the candles lit, and everything was just as it should be. We were going to have a quiet dinner, catch up, and maybe even laugh about something silly. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. But when Brian walked in, everything felt different. There was something in the air that night, a tension that wasn't there before. He didn't smile at me like he normally would. His eyes were dark, not with the playful mischief they used to have, but with something else, something I didn't recognize. I had always been able to read Brian, to understand what was bothering him. But tonight, he felt like a stranger. "How was work?" I asked, trying to break the silence, my voice steady, though I could feel the unease building in my chest. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slung his bag onto the chair and ran his hand through his hair. A sign I'd seen before. One that always indicated frustration. "It was fine," he muttered, but there was a sharpness to his tone. I was used to Brian being a bit distant at times, especially after long days at his job, but this was different. There was a coldness in his voice that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't press him further. Instead, I served the food, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. As I sat down across from him, I noticed how he barely touched his food. His fork hovered above the mashed potatoes for a moment, before he set it down with a loud clink that echoed in the quiet room. "Brian, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice softer this time, trying to break through whatever wall he'd built between us. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a fury I had never seen before. I took a breath, my heart racing. Something was very wrong, but I couldn't place what it was. "You never listen to me," he spat, his voice rising. "I've had enough of this of you." My stomach dropped. It wasn't the words that stung, it was the way he said them. Like he was disgusted with me, like I was the one who had let him down. "Brian, I began. But before I could finish, he slammed his fist onto the table. The sound loud enough to make the glasses rattle. "You never get it," he shouted. His face was red, his jaw clenched, and I could see the anger bubbling to the surface. The Brian I knew was gone. In his place was someone unfamiliar, someone I didn't recognize. I opened my mouth to speak, to calm him down. But before I could say a word, he was up from the table. He was standing over me now, towering with a terrifying presence. The next moment happened so fast, I couldn't even process it. His hand struck my face hard. The slap echoed through the room like a clap of thunder, and before I could react, I felt the sting of it all over my cheek. I stumbled back in shock, my head spinning, my heart pounding. Brian didn't apologize. He didn't even seem to realize what he had done. He just turned away and stormed out of the room, leaving me there, stunned and speechless. I sat frozen at the table for what felt like an eternity, my hand pressed to my cheek, the pain not just physical, but something deeper, a pain I never thought I'd feel from my own son. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a wound that couldn't heal, of a broken trust that couldn't be mended. I never expected this. Not from Brian, not from the boy I had raised. But in that moment, I knew that everything had changed. Have you ever experienced a moment that made you question everything about a person you thought you knew? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. The morning after the slap, everything felt wrong. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, felt eerily still. I woke up earlier than usual, my body aching from the night before. But it wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on me. It was the suffocating silence that hung between Brian and me. I moved through the motions of my morning routine, pouring coffee, frying eggs, and making pancakes. The smells filled the kitchen, but none of it felt comforting. My hands moved with precision, the rhythm of the task offering a false sense of control. I didn't want to think about last night. I didn't want to relive the sting of Brian's slap, the look in his eyes when he walked away from me like I was nothing. But I couldn't avoid it. It was there, always in the back of my mind, pushing me toward something I wasn't ready for. Brian had come home late the night before, but he hadn't apologized. In fact, he hadn't said a word to me after his outburst. He had stormed to his room, slamming the door behind him, leaving me to grapple with the silence. And now, here we were, still trapped in it. I set the table for breakfast just as I always did. 2 plates, 2 cups of coffee, Brian's favorite pancakes, the ones he used to eat with a smile, now felt like a cruel reminder of the person he had become. As I placed the pancakes on the table, I couldn't help but wonder. Was it too soon to confront him? Was I being too harsh? Too quick to judge? The mother in me wanted to forgive him, to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was. But the woman in me, the woman who had been slapped by her own son, knew things could never be the same. I glanced over at his bedroom door, wondering if he was awake. I had no idea what to expect from him this morning. Would he apologize? Or would he act like nothing happened? I had no answers, but what I did have was a plan. While the coffee brewed, I slipped a letter into Brian's bag. I had written it late last night, my words sharp and deliberate. It wasn't just a letter about what had happened. It was a declaration, a line in the sand. It detailed the hurt I felt, but more than that, it reminded him that he couldn't get away with this. He would have to face the consequences of his actions. I couldn't let this go, not without showing him that I wouldn't tolerate being treated like this. I had spent years enabling him, protecting him from the hard truths of life, but not anymore. This was my wake-up call, and I was going to make sure Brian understood that. The smell of pancakes was suddenly overpowering, and my stomach turned. I forced myself to keep moving, to keep busy, to avoid thinking about the conversation we would have. The sound of footsteps from upstairs brought me back to reality. Brian was awake. I set the letter down beside his plate, my hands trembling slightly. I hadn't told him I had written it, and I wasn't sure how he would react when he found it. But it had to be done. Brian walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel the weight of his presence. I watched as he sat down at the table, the silence between us almost suffocating. He didn't speak, didn't touch the pancakes. His eyes flicked to the letter, then back to the food, but he didn't say a word. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd finally apologize. But the tension was so thick I could cut it with a knife. And then, without another glance, he stood up and left, his footsteps fading down the hallway. No words, no acknowledgement of the distance growing between us. I sat down at the table, my hands clenched into fists. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, to force him to face me. But another part of me, the part I had been ignoring for years, knew that I had to let him go. I had to let him figure it out, and I had to prepare for what came next. The letter was out there. The ball was in his court now. Have you ever had to make a tough decision about someone you loved, even when it meant standing up to them? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. The slap still stung, but it was the silence that was the hardest to bear. Brian and I moved around the house like strangers, each of us pretending that nothing was wrong, yet everything felt wrong. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, it was as if we were on opposite sides of an invisible wall. I tried to keep up appearances. I made breakfast, I cleaned the house, and I kept the routine going. But inside, I was torn. Brian's actions had shaken me to the core, and I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. I had always been the one to protect him, to put his needs above my own. But now, I was beginning to see that he didn't need protection from the world, he needed protection from himself. And maybe, just maybe, I had been enabling him for too long. Every morning, I watched him sit at the breakfast table, staring into his coffee cup, lost in his thoughts. He would barely speak, his eyes cold and distant. I tried to reach out, but each attempt was met with resistance. It was as if he had built an impenetrable wall around himself, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break through. It wasn't just the silence that worried me. It was the way he was acting. The little things I had started to notice, the phone calls he would take in private, the way he would disappear for hours without explanation. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking, but deep down, I knew something was off. Brian had always been open with me about everything, but now, he was closing himself off. Then, one afternoon, I received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a lawyer, someone I had never met before, but the name on the caller ID was enough to make my heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Harris, I'm afraid I have some concerning news about your son." "Brian," the lawyer said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "It appears that there's been some financial activity that may be less than above board." I felt my blood run cold. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. Financial activity? What was he talking about? Brian had always been responsible with money, or so I thought. The lawyer explained that he had been looking into a case that involved Brian, and it seemed that Brian had been making some questionable financial decisions that could potentially harm our family. There were discrepancies in some of the accounts, and from what the lawyer could gather, it looked like Brian had been hiding money, possibly to avoid paying debts. My stomach twisted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brian, my son, the boy I had raised with so much love, was hiding things from me. Things that were going to affect us both. "Is there anything you can do to stop this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't understand. Why would Brian do this?" The lawyer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Unfortunately, Mrs. Harris, it's difficult to say at this point. We need more information, but the situation is serious. I'd advise you to speak with Brian about this directly." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Was Brian really capable of this? Of lying? Of hiding things from me? It didn't make sense. The boy I knew would never do this, or at least, I didn't think he would. But the more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The late nights, the sudden changes in his behavior, the secrecy. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was plotting. He was working behind my back, and I had no idea just how deep this went. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had known about my son was a lie. I had always been there for him, had always trusted him, and now, it felt like that trust had been shattered. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just sit back and let him destroy everything. As I sat there, my mind racing, I found something that confirmed all of my worst fears. I had always been the one to go through Brian's things when I suspected something was off. It was a mother's intuition, I guess. And that night, as I rifled through his coat pocket, I found a small envelope hidden inside. I opened it, my hands shaking, and inside was a series of documents, financial statements, credit card receipts, and bank transfer records, all of them leading back to Brian. It was all there. Proof of his lies, his deceit, and the worst part? He had been using my name to hide it all. The money he had been taking, the debts he had been incurring, it was all being done on my behalf, without my knowledge. I had been played. I closed the envelope and placed it on the table. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let this go. Brian had crossed a line I never thought he would. And now, I had to make a choice. Would I confront him, or would I let him continue to manipulate me? Have you ever discovered a secret that shook your trust in someone you loved? How did you handle it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been living in the shadow of my own son's manipulation for far too long. The pain of his betrayal still lingered, but it was overshadowed by something else, now a deep, unshakable resolve. I could no longer be the passive victim in this scenario. I had spent my entire life putting his needs before mine, but the time had come for me to reclaim my power. I started by making small changes. I cut off his access to the things he took for granted: the car, the credit cards, the privileges I had always given him without question. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Brian had to learn that the comfort and freedom he enjoyed came with consequences, and I wasn't going to allow him to take advantage of me any longer. The first step was consulting with a lawyer. I hadn't told Brian about the financial documents I had found, but I knew I needed legal protection. I needed to ensure that I was in control of my assets, and that Brian couldn't manipulate me or my resources any further. The lawyer was sympathetic, but also firm. "You've done well by yourself for a long time, Mrs. Harris," he said, his voice calm but reassuring. "Now it's time to make sure your son understands that you're not someone he can use." I left his office feeling a strange sense of calm. I was no longer helpless. I was taking action. I wasn't just a mother trying to fix things for her son anymore. I was a woman who had learned that sometimes love meant setting hard boundaries, no matter how painful it might be. Brian had always been entitled, taking without ever truly appreciating the sacrifices I had made. The worst part? I had let it happen. But now, things were different. I wasn't going to let him manipulate me, not when I had so much to lose. The following days were filled with a quiet intensity. I kept to myself, going through my routine with purpose. I didn't want to give Brian any hints that I was planning something. I knew he would try to manipulate the situation if he had even the slightest inkling of my intentions. I started making calls, setting up appointments, and arranging things without his knowledge. The most difficult part was still to come: the confrontation. I had been avoiding it for days, trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation. But there was no more waiting. No more putting it off. It was time to confront Brian about his betrayal and make him understand that I was no longer a pawn in his game. Before I confronted him, I left him a letter. It wasn't just any letter, it was my final word, my declaration that I was done enabling him. It was firm but loving, a reminder of the boy he used to be, and the man he could still become if he made the right choices. I placed it on the kitchen table, next to the breakfast he refused to eat. I knew he would see it, and I knew he would read it. It was a letter, but it was more than that. It was my line in the sand. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the note I had left behind, and I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years: power. It wasn't anger that I was feeling, it was resolve. The same resolve that had always kept me going as a mother. But now it was focused on protecting myself, on putting my needs first for once. Brian would have to face the consequences of his actions, and I would make sure of it. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you loved, even when it was difficult? How did you handle the situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The moment had arrived. I had waited, prepared, and strategized for this day. The calm before the storm had passed, and now, the storm was here. There was no turning back. I stood in the living room, the letter I had written to Brian still fresh in my mind. The words, once careful and measured, now felt like a final declaration. I was no longer the same woman who had put up with Brian's manipulations for so long. I had faced the painful truth that my son was no longer the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved. No, now he was a stranger, someone who had become a part of the chaos, the lies, and the deception. The door creaked open, and I knew Brian was coming in. His footsteps were slow, as if he were unsure of what was to come. But I wasn't unsure. I was ready. I had to be. "Mom," Brian said, his voice low and almost tentative, as though he were testing the waters. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I waited. I had spent too many years talking, explaining, and trying to fix things. Today, it was his turn to listen. Today, I was in control. I turned to face him, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. His body language was defensive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, as if trying to protect himself from whatever was coming. He didn't know that the walls he had built between us were the very same ones I was going to tear down. "Sit down, Brian," I said, my voice steady. Even. The anger that had simmered inside me for so long had transformed into something more controlled, more purposeful. He hesitated but then reluctantly lowered himself into the chair across from me. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze was focused on the floor, a sure sign he was trying to avoid the confrontation. But I wasn't going to let him avoid it any longer. "Do you know what this is?" I said, slamming the stack of documents on the table in front of him. The sound of the papers hitting the wood was sharp, a clear signal that this was no ordinary conversation. I watched his face change as he recognized what I had placed before him. He glanced down at the papers, financial records, bank transfers, credit card receipts. All of it was there, everything I had discovered. The evidence of his betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. "What? What are you doing, Mom?" he stammered, his eyes shifting uneasily, as though he were searching for an escape. "This isn't what you think." "No." "Brian," I said, cutting him off, my voice firm. "This is exactly what I think. You've been lying to me, stealing from me while I've been giving you everything." His face twisted with anger. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to fix things for you. For us. You're just too blinded by your own guilt to see it." "Guilt?" I scoffed, my heart pounding. "You think I'm guilty for not seeing what you've been doing behind my back? For not realizing you've been using me as a pawn in your game? Well, I see it now, Brian. I see it all." Brian's face reddened with frustration. "You don't understand. You never did. You've always been so wrapped up in what you wanted, you couldn't see what I needed." His voice grew louder, but it lacked the confidence it had earlier. It was desperation now. I leaned forward, my gaze never leaving his. "I see it perfectly now. You've been hiding behind your anger, your manipulation, thinking you could control me, but you can't anymore." The tension in the room was suffocating. His breathing grew heavier, his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But something in his eyes shifted. I could see the guilt beginning to creep in. The weight of the truth was finally sinking in. "You don't get it," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I shook my head, standing up and walking around the table. "It's too late for sorry, Brian. You've crossed a line, and I can't just forgive you like I used to. Not this time." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But there was nothing left to say. I had made my decision. And now, Brian had to face the consequences of his actions. Have you ever had to confront someone you loved about a painful truth? How did you find the strength to do it? Let me know in the comments. The days following the confrontation were a blur. My mind raced with the weight of everything that had happened. But one thing was clear. The air in this house had shifted. The silence that once suffocated me now felt different, thicker, charged with the finality of what I had done. I had drawn a line, and there was no turning back. Brian hadn't spoken much since that night. He would leave in the mornings, avoiding eye contact, and come home late, his presence lingering only long enough to remind me of the wreckage we were both trying to ignore. The tension was palpable, but it wasn't just his guilt that weighed on me now. It was mine, too. I had never wanted things to get this far. But once the trust was broken, once the truth was revealed, I couldn't unsee it. I had made my decision. It wasn't enough to confront him. I needed to protect myself, my emotional and financial well-being. For the first time in years, I realized I had been living in his shadow, trying to fix his mistakes, covering for him, and thinking that one day he would come around. But that day would never come unless I made it happen. I met with the lawyer again, this time to finalize the legal steps that would secure my future. It wasn't easy to ask for help, but I knew I had to. My house, my finances, everything was at risk if I didn't take action. The lawyer helped me draft the necessary documents, cutting off Brian's access to my bank accounts, his name removed from any joint ownerships, and his right to live in the house revoked. The hardest part, though, was what came next. I had to tell him. It was late when Brian came home, his usual tired expression heavy on his face. The front door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I would reclaim my life. "Brian," I said, my voice steady but firm. He looked at me, the annoyance in his eyes evident. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of his anger or his guilt. I wasn't afraid of the son I had raised, who had betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined. "We need to talk." He dropped his bag on the couch and sat down, running his hand through his hair. "What now?" he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I handed him the papers. "These are the legal documents," I said, my tone unwavering. "You're no longer welcome here. I'm giving you a week to pack up and find somewhere else to go." Brian's eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious. Mom, you can't just—" "I'm not asking for your permission, Brian," I interrupted, my voice rising slightly. "This is my decision. You've lied, manipulated, and used me for far too long. I've given you more chances than I should have. But now, I'm taking control of my life." He opened his mouth, but I didn't give him the opportunity to argue. "You will never hurt me again. Not emotionally, not financially. You're on your own now." For a long moment, he just stared at the papers, his mouth moving, but no words coming out. His face twisted between anger and disbelief, but there was something else in his eyes, something that almost looked like regret or maybe fear. "I don't need your help anymore," I said, my voice colder than I had intended. "And I won't let you drag me down with you." Brian stood up, his hands shaking. "You're making a huge mistake." "No," I said softly, but firmly. "The mistake was mine, trusting you for so long." The weight of the words hung in the air, and Brian seemed to shrink, the defiance in his posture fading away. He stood there, frozen for a moment, before he turned and walked toward the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't apologize. He just left. The door closed behind him with a finality I couldn't ignore. I sat down on the couch, the silence overwhelming. But this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was freeing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had reclaimed something. I thought I had lost my peace. The betrayal, the anger, the manipulation, it was all behind me now. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the lingering question. Would Brian ever come back? Would he learn from his mistakes? Or would he continue down this destructive path? I didn't know. What I did know was that I had made the right decision for myself. And no matter what happened next, I was finally in control. Have you ever had to make a tough decision to protect yourself, even if it meant letting go of someone you loved? How did it feel to take that step? Share your experience in the comments below. The days after Brian left were quiet, too quiet. The house, once filled with the noise of his presence, now felt empty in a way that was almost peaceful. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the silence. I kept expecting him to come back, to knock on the door and beg for forgiveness, maybe even try to make things right. But each day passed without him, and the quiet grew louder, more profound. I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Brian wasn't coming back, not the way I had hoped, and I had to accept that. The reality of it still hit me hard sometimes, like a weight on my chest, but I was learning to breathe through it. I spent my mornings walking through the house, each room now feeling like a space I had to claim for myself. No longer would I be defined by the woman who had given up everything for her son. No longer would I hide behind the good mother label that had been so carefully crafted over the years. It wasn't that I hadn't loved Brian, I had. But I had lost myself in the process of loving him, and that was a lesson I would carry with me forever. I started picking up pieces of my life that I had long abandoned, my hobbies, my friendships, and even the small, quiet moments I had once savored before they were overshadowed by his needs. I began taking yoga classes again, something I had loved but put on hold when Brian's needs always seemed to come first. I visited old friends who had been there for me long before Brian had ever needed me. I even found time to start reading books for pleasure again, losing myself in stories that weren't about my family or their demands. I realized that I was building a new version of myself, one that was whole, one that was independent, and one that was no longer shackled by guilt or obligation. At night, I would sit in my favorite chair by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the floor, and I would reflect on everything I had been through. The pain of Brian's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. The weight of his absence, the quiet ache of his departure, it didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a scar, a reminder of a difficult but necessary choice. Choosing myself over him had been the hardest thing I had ever done. Every fiber of my being screamed to reach out to him, to fix what was broken. But I had learned that love doesn't always mean giving in. Sometimes, love means standing firm, even when it hurts. I had always been the one to forgive, to take on the burden of someone else's mistakes. But this time, I had given myself permission to walk away from a love that had turned toxic, and while the journey had been painful, it was also empowering. I had reclaimed my life, my peace, and my strength. There was still a part of me that wondered about Brian, about where he was and what he was doing, but the part of me that had been broken was no longer asking the questions. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I wasn't waiting for his apology or his change. I had freed myself from the expectations that had kept me trapped for so long. Looking out the window, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The future was uncertain, yes. But for the first time in a long time, it was my future, and that thought filled me with quiet hope. I had the power to rebuild. I had the power to choose what came next. I wasn't defined by my family's manipulation anymore. I wasn't defined by the mistakes they had made, or by the mistakes I had made in trying to fix them. I was free, and that was the most liberating feeling in the world. Have you ever had to let go of someone you loved in order to find peace? How did you move forward? Share your thoughts with me in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.